decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Before we get started, just wanted to thank all our sponsors again. The League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the library, please feel free to cheer after every one of them. I will stop for that. The Manitowoc Library Foundation Board, the Friends of the Manitowoc Public Library, who you should clap for since they are responsible for the treats that you enjoy. There we go.
One of the treats.
You're the most special of treats. UW Manitowoc and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Before I turn it over to the person who will be introducing our speaker tonight, I just wanted to call two things to your attention. One of them, well, both of them, are ways to donate to the library. It's wonderful that we have such a great turnout, and it's wonderful that we can present programs like this at the library, but we also need help, and the foundation provides a lot of that help, but we need your help to keep presenting things like that. I don't think I could have worked help into my sentence any more time than that. But over by the donation box, you will see two flyers. One is for traditional donating, setting up a legacy, things like that. The other thing that I wanted to call to your attention is the flyers that are over there for a gala that we have coming up on Saturday, March 10th from 6 to 10 p.m. called Create Tomorrow. It's going to be an incredible evening at the library. A lot of things you wouldn't expect to see in the library, including an aerial dance troupe from Madison, Wisconsin, who will be performing in the library. If you look on your way out, you won't be able to guess where things are going to be appearing. But I guarantee you this will be happening on Saturday the 10th. There's also going to be an auction within it, and someone in the crowd tonight, whose name won't be mentioned, has just added an additional item to the auction, which will be a flight tour of Manitowoc County. And knowing this person, not only will you get a beautiful flight, but there probably will be a show involved with it as well. A few jokes may be involved, but I won't mention any names. However, without further ado, I would like to introduce Kathleen Fishbeck, who will be introducing our speaker this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim. What a wonderful crowd. Yeah. I don't know if it's John, who has lots of friends in Francis Creek, that has brought everybody out, or everybody was interested. But it's indeed a pleasure for me to introduce him. But before I introduce our guest speaker, what I'd like to do is to thank two groups. The first is the Herald Times, because they've done a wonderful job of publicizing these lovely announcement, followed by a lovely summary that we read in the paper last week, and then again this week I woke up and I read the paper and the big headlines, Russia, topic at Great Decisions, so it's just wonderful. And the other group that I would like to thank is all of you. One of the joys that we have in calling people to be the speakers for this series is telling them, you know, we usually have a crowd of such and such, and everyone responds, well, I'm glad to come to Manitowoc because you have such wonderful crowds. Really is. The questions are unbelievable, and isn't it encouraging to know how many people that we have in Manitowoc that know so much about what's happening in the world in the area of foreign services. So thanks to each and every one of you for coming. It's really a pleasure. In talking with some of my colleagues who used to teach as I did, I said, you know what, maybe we should offer refreshments at our lectures, and then we could get all these people to come. Anyway, with that brief thank you to those two groups, I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is John Katzka. He's a native of Wisconsin. He did his undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I think in international relations, right? And then he did graduate work at Georgetown and also at American University in Sino-Soviet politics. And we're going to hear about Russia today, but we'll hear about China in a couple of weeks. He is a retired Foreign Service officer. He was a senior counselor, which means that he had, if you want to compare it to the military, he had a rank of a brigadier general. So he's high up in the Foreign Service. He was in the Foreign Service for 38 years. And if I remember correctly, he had two tours in Moscow. He was in Romania, Thailand, Yugoslavia, Zambia, and of course he spent quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that was the worst part.
He's a regular on the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's program, which is called International Focus, and I read it was the only locally produced TV program dedicated exclusively to global affairs. He also is very much involved in the Great Decisions program at Cedarburg. And he's been a real godsend for us, because if we run out of people to speak, we always call John, and John says, well, you can call Doug, and then Doug says, well, I think Ann will do it. So he's been a real help there. He's also does a program, and he maybe can say something, it's called the Hot Spot of the Month at the Cedarburg Library. And then he's also the co-coordinator of the Milwaukee chapter of the World Future Society. So that's what he does in the greater Milwaukee area, but in his own town of Cedarburg, or his town now, Cedarburg, he's very much involved with the library. He's been past and now present
Past president.
Past president of the Friends of the Library. I'm sure that he's on the Park Commission and many, many other things.
And I'm now a trustee for the Monarch system.
Oh, the Monarch system, okay. So anyway, you can see that he's retired, but he certainly isn't retired. He's very involved in the state level and also in the level at his local community. So, John, we thank you for coming. We're looking forward to what you have to say, and certainly there's not a topic that's more in the forefront right now than Russia.
Well, thank you. It's a couple of years since I was here last. I think this is my third or fourth visit here, and so those of you who have come back, I'm grateful. Libraries are very important to me. I'm not only the past president of the Friends of the Library, where we had term limits, but I spent 10 years as the president because we were building a new library. And I was involved in raising $800,000 towards that library. And now I'm the co-chair of the Art Foundation, as well as a former friend of the library. I'm going to start by giving you a map. That is the Russian Federation, Russia. It is 16 time zones. Back in 1991, I was the Minister Counselor for Public Affairs at the embassy. I flew from, let's go back, get the wrong one. I want the pointer. Does the pointer work?
Yep, I just have to get it.
Well, over here is Moscow in this area. I flew out to Khabarovsk out here. There was only 11 time zones. It was on a Soviet aircraft. My knees were up into my chest, and I swear they served me the same rubber chicken both ways. Looking at the size of it, you get a sense of not only the range, but the potential. And potential has been part of Russia's history and will be part of its future. Much of that in the north is permafrost, but with climate change, they're even talking about having year-round navigation through the Bering Straits. So all of this is in transition. Some of you may have seen this one before. Foreign affairs is realists versus idealists. And it shouldn't be a competition, but often it is. Realists look at national interests, the more pragmatic dimensions of our international relations. Idealists focus on moral aspects. How do our values affect an issue? Concerns like democracy and human rights come up here. Rarely is anyone totally an idealist or a realist. One's position can change depending on circumstances. Also, one position is not more correct than the other. But there are costs and consequences to whichever policy you take, depending upon which orientation we favor, realist or idealist. So keep this in the back of your mind, not only for tonight's talk about Russia's foreign policy, but as you look at other areas like China, like Turkey, think in terms of this where you fit on the spectrum of idealist versus realist, and listen to what the speaker has, because he'll have a perspective as well. And I can guarantee that they will come in on one of those, lean towards, at least towards one of those positions. I'm going to give you another template to look at. And this also can apply to the range of topics that you're going to look at. A country's importance. Historical cultural influences. We tend to ignore those when we make policy. Relations with neighbors. Are their neighbors more powerful, less powerful, insignificant? Geography. Are they protected by two oceans? Or do they have gateways that run right up through parts of their country? Foreign policy stakeholders. The military is obviously a stakeholder in that. You all are stakeholders, but you don't generally, even the backbenchers back there are stakeholders. Yeah. The domestic situation and the state of the economy. And ideology. Okay, let's go to look at Russia, how Russia fits those various criteria. Importance? Yes, Russia was and is the most important country in the region. It would like to be more important internationally, but economic realities make that difficult. I was noting at dinner tonight that as I've given these talks, the size of my font gets larger and larger. Further, Russia would like to serve as a model for other authoritarian regimes that seem to be popping up all over the place. And I think you're talking about Turkey next week. Turkey is one of those places. Moving on to history. Whoops, went too fast. Russia's foreign policy is strongly affected by its history and its culture. Let me sum up 10 centuries into one quote by a Russian historian. The history of Russia is the history of a country being colonized. Russia's march south and east paralleled the decline of the Mongol domination. The Mongols ruled Russia for more than 200 years, the 13th to the 16th century. And they had a tremendous impact on Russian culture. But equally important, this was the time when Western Europe was going through the Renaissance and the Reformation. And Russia was isolated and never participated in that. So their culture starts from very different bases than what we have. During that colonization period that I referred to, Siberia was incorporated beginning in 1582. The Ukraine in 1654. This was a religious issue. Ukrainians were Orthodox. The Poles who had occupied Ukraine were Catholics. The chief Cossack leader of the time declared for Russia, and they became part of Russia from then on. Since 1654, Ukraine has been part of Russia. The Far East expansion began in 1689 and continued southward as the Qing dynasty weakened in China. The Crimea was annexed in 1783. They took it from the Ottomans. The Caucasus beginning in 1813 until 1864. And Central Asia, that area that practitioners refer to as the stands, also in the 1800s. For those who may not know, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan all have stands at the end of them, so they're called the stands. Also in the 1800s. One of the problems with the larger type is you have to turn pages more often. The Soviets took power in 1917 and lost it in 1992. How's that for covering them 65, 75 years in a short sentence? The change from czars to commissars reminds of the important role of culture even when a new ideology is at play. The country was run largely the way it had been run before, centrally managed, the group over the individual, and the importance of politics over economics, and something called zero-sum economics. That is, and this is very foreign to American audiences, the idea that the economic pie is of a limited size. If you get a bigger piece, that means I get a smaller piece. Try that. It seems illogical to us, but it is a central factor. If you're looking at Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia in the Tsarist period, it was true. The major change was new elites. Nobility out, party members in. The fall of the Soviet Union and the brief but painful democratic period under Yeltsin ended even before Putin became president in 1999. I had a front row seat of the break of the Soviet Union. I was number 3 in the embassy at the time. I was a minister counselor for public affairs, so I was the mouthpiece of the embassy. You can see I didn't go too far away from that tree. We, the US, had marvelous dreams of reinventing Russia along democratic and market economic lines. It was working in Eastern Europe. Why not Russia? However, neither they nor we were prepared for the chaos of the Yeltsin period, nor were the people we worked with representative of Russia. We were talking to generally English-speaking, highly educated people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we weren't out into the countryside. An important cultural attitude of Russians is their fear of chaos, an attitude that is more important to most Russians than individual rights or concepts like liberty. While Putin talked about a return to law and order, his treasury was empty, his people were demoralized, and his institutions collapsing. When oil prices began to rise in 2003, if you remember that, Russia rebuilt its treasury. Russia did not go on an infrastructure building campaign. It just built up a treasury. It amassed over $600 billion in reserves. That gives them a little bit of room to play with. In the same time frame that this was all happening, the late 1990s into the early 2000s, we and our European allies moved quickly to roll back the Iron Curtain, starting with enlarging NATO to include East European countries and then pushing into the former Soviet republics. First into the Baltics in 1991, and then making overtures to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. During the Yeltsin years, there was little resistance. Starting around 2004, Russia began to push back. $600 billion in reserves kind of helps that process. And Russians can be rather direct, if not crude, when pushing back. Neighbors. Are we still on the same page here? Yes, we are. Ukraine is the most important part of Russian foreign policy concerns. Ukraine became part of Russia in 1654, as I mentioned. Key contributing a key contributing piece of territory is, and I'm going to go to the next slide, is the territory along that yellow piece that's on the left side there. That was Poland until after the end of World War II. The Soviet Union took it as its rights after winning the war. This piece of Western Ukraine has been a hotbed of anti-Soviet and now anti-Russian agitation. In fact, following World War II, in this part of there was an open insurgency in this part of Ukraine. Contrast that with the eastern part of the country, which is more Russian-oriented. And Kiev in the middle, right, we're kind of, let's see, Kiev should be right in here on the river, is more in the middle. I'm going to go back to our factors again. I just turned it off. I'm working on this. There we are. So we got some more of those factors to go through. The stakeholders. A word about the Siloviki. The Russian word for strength is silo. And the Siloviki were former KGB types, mostly connected to Putin when he was in Leningrad. And they took over lots of industries. Also of importance are the oligarchs. And does the library have the video, the DVD of the Great Decisions talks? There is an excellent discussion about how these oligarchs and some of the Siloviki got control over these industries. Russian people were given ownership when they were privatized, and because they had no value and they were starving, I mean, the place was in collapse, the people were able to amass ownership of these companies with very small output. And the other military-industrial complex in almost every country is a stakeholder in the foreign policy of the country, as it is in our own. Okay, domestic economy. Yes, sanctions and oil prices have hurt Russia. Russia has an interesting dichotomy here on economics and politics. Politics dominates Trump's economics, most times. So when things get bad there, Russians have a capability to muddle through, much more so than almost every other culture and country I've served in during my time. A question about, well, the nest egg has been severely depleted. In terms of all of these negatives, Putin is still broadly accepted and even applauded for, one, sticking it in our, every time he does something that we're unhappy with, the Russian people are very pleased with that. That shows that they are big players again. And also, Russians like a strong leader. We like to take down our leadership. Bring them down to our size. That's not true there. I mean, the counter to that is what I said earlier about chaos. Russians abhor the idea of chaos. They want things to be orderly and predictable. Regarding unrest, be careful of media reports, mostly limited to cities, mostly Moscow, and not generally indicative of the mood of the country, which is largely rural. There are protests going on. They could become important. one of my notes to myself here is just remember that even when the whole of Russia was modestly happy with the condition where they were, in 1970, a very small group, the Bolsheviks, took over. So things can happen. But generally, as we look at Russia today, the people are supportive of Putin. One of the things that's growing is concern about, I'll get to that later. I got ahead of myself. There is growing evidence that the sanctions, those we imposed, the West, US and Europe, and the counter-sanctions, Russians applied sanctions to especially European companies that wouldn't allow them to send in certain kinds of goods, are making Russia more self-sufficient. And having spent some time in Africa, 3 years in Zambia, just after Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, I'm reminded of how self-sufficient Rhodesia was when all those sanctions were being applied to them. And that could become a net plus, but I think it's too early to say whether this tendency has any legs. On the issue of ideology, the last one of these topics, Putin is pragmatic on foreign affairs. That's my view. He has shown that he is prepared to do what it takes to protect Russian national interests. I hold, and I've said this for a few years now, that he doesn't want to recreate the former Soviet Union or Tsarist Russia. And there's a reason for that. However, he doesn't want to see unfriendly countries on its border. I mean, we've gone through some of that ourselves. I think it was a Secretary of State Kerry said that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. I don't believe that. If we have and look at what all we did to deal with Cuba when it became a thorn in our side. So I don't think it's an unjustified conclusion to say Russia wants to have friendly countries on its borders. While politics generally trumps economics, I've said that now 4 times, Putin recognized the cost of maintaining the former empire and that it was a heavy drain on Moscow and a constant requirement for maintaining control. Though friendly would be preferable, and I'm stretching now, neutral could be acceptable, at least for now. If you were looking for pictures and cartoons, you'll have to wait. As a diplomat, I was schooled to look at all sides of an issue. And that means reporting back the good and the bad, and how we are being perceived, how our policies are being perceived, and whether or not our policies have any chance of being successful in the country to which I was accredited. Russia has much experience with foreign invasions. Remember Napoleon and Hitler. Remember that map of the Ukraine. That, by the way, that was a map put out by the Ukraine government because it has all sorts of little attachments to it about where they would like to go with this. All these experiences have exposed a geographical reality in the Russians' mind, not necessarily ours, but in their mind, that Russia is vulnerable through its soft underbelly, and the way to that soft underbelly is through Belarus and Ukraine. Russia will not willingly allow the Ukraine to become part of NATO. That actually, I suspect that could go to war over that issue. Millions, and there's another issue, millions of native Russians. Remember when it was the Soviet Union, none of those Ukraine, Russia, Tajikistan, none of them meant anything. Those were just geographical locations. They had no political significance. All the power was rested in the Central Committee and in the Presidium of the Communist Party in Moscow. So geographical considerations were important, political were not. Millions of native Russians just moved around. I mean, people moved. There are lots of Central Asians in Moscow. There were lots of Ukrainians in Moscow, lots of Russians in Ukraine. 51% when I was there as late as 1992, 51% of Riga, the capital of Latvia, was Russian. Now, some of that was meant to give Moscow more control, because they felt that the Russians there would be more amenable to Russian rule. And there were parts of Lithuania, for example, that Kaunas, that we were never allowed to go visit because there was so much agitation there. Millions of these Russians live in these foreign countries after the breakup. Russian officials have waved that flag in recent years, suggesting that Russia has the right to defend those nationals. And right now, the Russians in Riga is down to 37%. There's also a major Russian enclave in northern Kazakhstan. And it's interesting, the effect of the EU, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are part of the EU now. And the EU has put enormous pressure on them for them to respect the minority Russians' rights, which is almost interesting. Oil prices are better, but below the $80 a barrel Russia budgeted for in 2014. It's currently about $65 a barrel. What this means is that Russians are digging deeper into that $600 billion nest egg in order to survive. Sanctions have hurt, and there's talk of more. Although the last word out of Washington is that the administration was not going to move on further sanctions. The ruble has dropped in value. Infrastructure demands are growing, and Russia's needs in this regard make our concerns very modest. Regions outside of Moscow have been neglected, as they always have been neglected. I remember reading, and even in Russian, books about Russians traveling. It was mostly the nobility traveling. Peasants didn't get to travel. It was hardship to travel. They had way stations for the horses, and they had little inns that were set up. It was very tough, and it's not much better now. In spite of all this, as I mentioned earlier, his popularity remains high, partly because he's feuding with us, partly because the Russians want a strong leader. As I noted, sometimes I get ahead of myself and have to repeat these things, you know. But repetition isn't bad, is it? I mean, it may stay. The powers and limitations that Putin faces today are not dissimilar to those that the czars had and the commissars had. There is a continuum in Russia. There are problems. The Soloviki, those former KGB comrades of Vladimir Putin, are not happy. They're being pressed. And he is watching them carefully, I can tell you that. Putin's party, political party, United Russia, is dropping in the polls. Putin himself is distancing himself from the party. There is growing unhappiness about corruption and increasing demands for accountability. that may make Putin launch just such a campaign. He's distancing himself from the political party, so he can come in and say, who better than I to clean house? He can take out some rivals in the process and take some pressure off the demonstrations. I haven't read that. You just crawled inside my head, and if we were experiencing that level of economic and political difficulty, I think we would see open revolt. But Russia isn't America, and they don't play by the same rules. Remember that the group is more important than the individual. Individuals are it doesn't come up. It's your village, your family, your village, your city, your oblast, all of those things come, and then not anywhere on there is you, the individual. And that's historic. There have always been noisy fringe groups who garner especially international attention, but they do not represent the majority of Russians. However, as I mentioned earlier, such a little minority as the Bolsheviks did take over in 1917. Crimea. I do not think that Crimea serves as any kind of a precedent. I feel that the historical record and the geopolitical realities support Russia's claim. Khrushchev transferred control from Russia to Ukraine in 1954-55 timeframe because it was to provide administrative support for Crimea. It had nothing to do, as I mentioned earlier, with political issues, because Ukraine was a geographical point. It was not a political base. So this was just to streamline the way things were being done. When the Soviet Union fell apart, this administratively was still under the Ukraine, but Russians have never, ever stopped thinking of Crimea as anything but theirs. Russia is now building a bridge from Russia to Crimea to provide that administrative support. That's actually a positive in that there is another way in which they could get to provide support, and that means to take all the territory in Ukraine between there. Now, could they do it? Probably yes. Would it be bloody and senseless? Also, because it would just open up a open insurgency that would go on for a long time. On Ukraine, if you buy into the idealist model, your options are limited by how long will the various parties be willing to stay there and support what's going on in Ukraine. The Europeans are already reluctant to support the sanctions that we want to push. There are realities on the ground. Even with its economic issues, Russia has many levers to influence the Ukrainian economy, and it has a porous border to supply separatist forces. That's a reality. Then there is the Ukrainian reality. 10 years ago, 2004 is 13 years ago. The Orange Revolution captured our imagination. Everyone was really enthusiastic. Basically, it was that mainly the group from Western Ukraine who have been, and I'll mention something about that in a few minutes. I won't get ahead of myself. There was bold talk of reforms and a new beginning, quickly dissolved into the same old players and the same old game. Yanukovych, who was bounced out most recently, was there at that time. So was the opposition. They were all in there together. Remember, if the Ukraine had a functioning economy, we'd be seeing a very different picture now. The real power brokers, Ukrainian oligarchs, are looking out for their own interests, and the president is one of those oligarchs. In fact, the former Georgian president, Saakashvili, if you saw it in the newspaper, has been running around trying to agitate against the present administration because of corruption. Things are just falling back into the old place. Those people who were on the Maidan in that square in Kiev, they either went back to their homes in the western Ukraine, or they're just not part of the political solution. So they're being overtaken by events again. In my second tour, that time when everything fell apart, I was invited to lead a group of embassy officers to the KGB museum. More important than the exhibits on American spies were the exhibits about the war that the KGB had waged against the insurgents in that part of western Ukraine. The grandchildren of those rebels are leading the charge against the established leadership in Ukraine and their Russian connections. They also led the charge during the Orange Revolution of 2004. There is no reason to predict a different outcome. If that was the idealist side. On the realist side, your options are not all that wonderful either. Regardless whether we were wise or not to have pushed as aggressively as we did against Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we are stuck with the results of that policy. A sea change in U.S. policy is unlikely. It's like turning an ocean liner. What Putin might have been willing to accept before our confrontation over Ukraine-Crimea may not be the same today. As things evolve, things can get worse. Russia's next steps in the Ukraine are hard to read. Eastern Ukrainians have to be war-weary. I mean, they've been under assault for 2-3 years now. The rest of Ukraine seems to be slipping back into the old culturally acceptable ways of control and corruption. Europe is tired of sanctions. Russia is an important market for Germany and most of Eastern Europe. And the exception there will be Poland. Poland is the most stridently anti-Russian amongst the East Europeans. How long they will support sanctions is a question. Nationalism is still an important factor in the EU, although elections in France and Denmark suggest that it is not a dominating factor. The nationalists are not in favor of sanctions. They're not in favor of the EU, generally. Russia has supported those nationalist causes the way we support democratic movements. Too soon to say how this will play out. If the economy is good in the EU, the status quo will win out. Also, we cannot correct overnight our economic and fiscal issues. To my mind, we're overstretched. And we can't seem to get our fingers off that tar baby that we found in the Middle East. Every time we try, a new person comes in, we just add another hand to the pile. The Middle East has not gone away, and we are back in Iraq, increasing our presence in Afghanistan, and we've added Syria. Although 1,200 troops is hardly a presence, it actually becomes more of a liability. War weariness on our part should be expected. And all of this limits our actions internationally. Russia has outmaneuvered us in Syria, setting up a model we now have to follow there in Syria. It's not that they haven't had problems, but we had even more problems. Though Russia has long established Syrian interest, I think its mission there was, one, to show us how it could be done. That's another time. You can count on Russia's foreign policy going forward for the foreseeable future until we change our position vis-a-vis Russia to look for opportunities, take a poke at us. And they will try and do it in the least invasive kind of way so it doesn't necessarily lead to something bigger. It also distracts our attention, the Syrian thing distracts our attention away from Ukraine.
Yes.
In the end, we need to consider the cost and consequences of our actions in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia before we pursue either idealist or realistic policies. Sometimes we can lay down markers that reflect our values. Sometimes we recognize our limitations or the consequences and move on. The new national defense strategy still holds the U.S. as the world's superpower. Russia and China are not going to be claiming that title anytime soon. But they are regional powers, and they can frustrate us significantly in their regions. And we have strong interest in both of those regions. Our ability to act everywhere is a non-starter. Meaning that while Russia and China have limitations, so do we. Okay, here's the cartoon. I told you there was going to be one. And the reason I left it for the end, because I don't think it's a foreign policy issue. I think it's a domestic issue. There is no doubt in my mind that Russia has been involved in our elections. And I hope it won't shock you. But we have done some of the same. Who's shocked? Of course, we are more subtle and high-minded. And that counts. But the effect is the same. According to Carnegie Mellon University professor Dov Levin, who has put together a database on this subject, we have interfered in foreign elections as many as 81 times between 1946 and 2000. That number doesn't include military coups and regime change efforts following the election of candidates we didn't like, notably those in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. Nor does it include assistance with the electoral process, such as election monitoring, training for political operatives, media training, and the like. Those are open programs that we do in lots of countries. We were doing those in Russia when I was there. The Russians didn't look as benignly upon that process as we were going and trying to tell their people, this is how you should behave. I have an adage that I will share with you. Democracy can be imported in. It is very difficult to export. My point is not that we shouldn't be concerned about Russian interference in our elections. Yes, we should. Just as they were upset with us for going about doing the kinds of things we were doing. But we should be aware that our outrage isn't the whole story. And I have not seen a major address or panel discussion or analysis that incorporates this other side of the story. And I think that's unfortunate. That means that we are being propagandized by, not just by the government, but by ourselves, because we're not looking at the whole story. The more important question in my mind is why did the Russians get involved to the degree that they did? I really don't think it was to get Donald Trump elected. Right up to the moment it happened, even his own people didn't believe he was going to get elected. Other reasons make more sense to me. There was definitely animosity between Putin and Hillary Clinton over her position on Ukraine and Crimea. And secondly, we have been beating up the Russians over their undemocratic elections and human rights violations. And it had to give them enormous pleasure to reveal that Democratic National Committee fight over whether who was the other candidate?
Bernie
Sanders and Clinton, where the Clinton people were trying to push him out of the way. And it was ugly. It was the kind of thing that happens in politics. But it doesn't go down when we're trying to say we're that shining city on the hill. It doesn't fit very well. Activities on social media and the revelations coming from the hacked DNC were ways to get back at Clinton and to show the world that our election process was not as clean as we like to tell the world. Moral mandates don't generally work well with geopolitical realities. That's a realist thought. Our diplomatic history is filled with instances where we have decided not to push our values because of other factors. During my time in Central Africa, I spent 3 lovely years in Zambia, a sportsman's paradise. It was wonderful. 4,000 feet up, very temperate climate, not what you think of Africa. Great played squash 6 times a week. There was a guy right next door called Mobutu. Mobutu in Zaire. I mean, you couldn't hardly find a more nasty character in the world. But we supported Mobutu because the alternative was chaos and collapse of that part of the world. And we still were in the Cold War. And we were competing in Africa with the Soviet Union for clients. Clients that would be useful in terms of making sure that the Soviets weren't able to set up organizations within the country, legal or illegal, votes for the UN, lots of different reasons. Look what happened when we removed Hussein. I mean, yes, he was a lousy, terrible person, but what came out of that? More chaos. And the same thing would happen to Libya is another case in point. So leaping, and I'm not saying that supporting the values, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you think that you want to support the values, factor in what the cost and consequences of doing that. Today, as we look at Russia, we are not witnessing a collapsed empire, but a country with great territory and resources, unlikely to go quietly into any sunset. Russia probably will not be a friend in the foreseeable future, but I hold that it doesn't have to be an adversary or an enemy, that there is a way we can find out. There are enough issues that we have in common that where we would have interest in seeing that through. And then there's that other old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So keeping our enemies close, keeping our friends close and enemies closer. None of this is going to be easy. There are rarely right or wrong answers, just costs and consequences. It's my favorite expression, costs and consequences. Repeat it tonight when you go to sleep, costs and consequences. Intended or unintended, because they can be both. Beware of people who say that there's only one issue involved here. Well, it rarely is only one issue. I have a friend and acquaintance in Cedarburg who says the Middle East is oil. Well, it's a very important point to the Middle East, but there's other issues in the Middle East than just oil. And beware 90-second TV broadcasts, where you're not even getting a decent one side of the story. The NewsHour does a much better job on PBS. The Economist is one of the better weekly journals. The library, I know, has a copy. And Foreign Affairs, though it is certainly establishment, it is moderately establishment. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. What a fantastic group.
All right, we'll get started with our question and answer period. As always, there is myself and working the other side of the room, the lovely and talented Roxanne Stavanus. We have a huge number here tonight, so...
Could I have the first question from the backbenchers?
You can call it out and we'll get the microphone. So remember, only one question or comment until everyone has gone through, and then we can double back if we have time. So...
And I just wanted to say that we do have a number of the past books and DVDs for great decisions over the past years. If you don't see one downstairs, have them ask for Roxanne, and I'll see what I can dig up for you. We're keeping some of them upstairs.
You'll be surprised if you go back and read them from 2 or 3 years ago, how little has changed.
And also, just for anyone following online, because we do have a number of people following along, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in, and I'll ask them for you in the room. So I think Roxanne has someone.
We have one.
Yes. Is this on? We always hear that Putin and his buddies are taking a lot of money out of the country and hiding it in all kinds of little places. Would you comment on that?
Yes. The question is, where is Putin and his buddies storing the cash? Up until recently, there was lots of innuendos and suggestions that he was taking care of himself. And I have a slightly different idea of what corruption is. There's two ways of looking at it. One, it's we live in a society where we can defer our gratification. Lots of places in the world, when you get into a position of power, you have no idea how long you're going to have access to that power. Not only that, in lots of, like Zambia, for example, where I served, the average family size was 20 people, 20 children. Yes, Zambia's blossoming. And you have a tribe, and you have an area that you lived in, and all of those people feel now that you've made it to this position of power, you have a responsibility to take care of them. So on the measly salaries that these officials get paid, and they really are very small salaries, they grab what they can. The second idea, and this came to me from someone who lived in a third world country, and that's actually rather ingenious. Instead of everyone paying a tax and therefore paying for the salary of someone who gives out licenses, only the people who need the license pay for the service. Now, that means that person isn't going to get a decent salary. And this was true in Thailand when I was there. The civil service got very, very low salaries. And that's why the Chinese like to put their children into the civil service, because they had already made the money, and this was a way in which they could join the middle class. But the idea that you could be, you're focusing the cost with the need. I'll let you think about that one. But yes, a couple of years ago, there was a revelation about, out of Panama, about a whole number of countries and people who were using a lawyer down there, a law firm, to be able to hide money away. And a cellist, obviously a very well-paid cellist, a good friend of Vladimir Putin, was one of the key players in this whole thing. So it sounds, I can't say for a fact that he is because his name was never there, but by association and innuendo, it looked as though he was involved in that. Does that answer your question?
I would like to know if there are any Russian factions, political parties, or anything like that that would be capable of taking on Putin and actually getting him out of the presidency.
Did everyone hear that? The short answer is there are none. The Communist Party in the late 90s looked like it had legs, that it was going to be able to get back something. But the rest of them are just small little, and there's no connections between them. Anything approximating what we would consider to be a liberal political party is a couple thousand in Moscow, maybe a couple hundred or 1,000 in St. Petersburg, and a handful in other major cities. So there just isn't. But our newspaper correspondents, when I was in Moscow in 90 to 92, we had 200 American correspondents in Moscow. 200. About 10 of them could write and speak Russian. The rest of them were at the embassy constantly looking for the hand-holding. Help me write this story. How do I get, So they tended to find the English speakers in Moscow, and they just, in many cases, enlarged significantly their importance. From the right side of the house. That's the way I'm looking at it.
I was just sitting here. You said before that. That politics overcomes economics, and you've got different factions there. You've got the KGB types and oligarchs. Now I'm sitting here thinking, what would happen if right now Mr. Cardiac Arrest hit Putin? Is there a succession to him? And if so, would the money overcome the politics? The oligarchs take over the KGB, or what would happen?
Well, the initial point would be, and that you raise a very. I'm going to take a guess because I don't know for a fact. I'm going to say that Medvedev is probably who's the prime minister, but it should be the vice president. It should be the vice president, and I don't think that's Medvedev. But the next most powerful person, the person who subbed for Putin when he couldn't serve as president anymore, is Medvedev.
But he's never going to be.
And they say it's right, so it must be. Go ahead. I'll repeat it.
Maybe, okay. Years ago, I worked in North Dakota, a small town, but it was surprising me a great number of Ukrainians settled there. And I found the sentiment of the Ukrainians was anti-communist. This was in the Cold War, primarily because they said Stalin, maybe in the late 30s or somewhere in there, maybe into the time of the Second World War, had drained the Ukraine of the food and left starving people there, and they never would forgive him for that.
There were more kulaks, as they were called.
Kulaks.
Kulaks were the, I hate to use the word wealthier, but they had more resources than the average peasant. And they were a threat to the Communist Party. And so they were the first ones eliminated among a lot of people who were
They were
eliminated.
the landowners.
Now, in Georgia, people still go around in taxis with little statues of Stalin. And they say the reason is because he killed so many Russians. I don't make this stuff up.
Yes. First of all, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
And then Paul Manafort was a big political shaker. Was he involved in the Ukraine trying to change the landscape and of the territory? And second was, with all the vacancies in the State Department, does that really hurt us?
Who was the name of the first in the first part?
Paul Manafort.
Could you repeat the question, please?
We aren't hearing very well.
Paul Manafort. I'm drawing a blank. Why do we not? Why should I know him?
He was helping the Ukrainian government.
Yes. Okay. I don't know where truth lies and where fiction begins to play out. Because as I started off my thing about the Russiagate, I think it's a domestic political issue. I think if we were prepared to recognize that we do some of this stuff, and we would be willing to say that at the same time we're blaming the Russians. And again, I'll repeat again, I think we should be concerned that the Russians are getting into our data banks, into our election systems, and it's something we should do about it. But let's not get sanctimonious about it, because this is what governments do. Just remember, it was in the Obama regime that we were listening to Merkel's telephone conversations. That's what you do. I mean, this is part of that's why you sent me to Washington. Well, maybe it wasn't the way. But on to the second part of your question, and let me pull that back. Give me a hand. Oh, the vacancies in the State Department. That's why I couldn't remember it. I'm no longer part of that program. In the absence of a political appointee, a career person steps into the job. When the political person comes in, that career person is the lifeline for that political appointee. It becomes important in senior positions, very senior positions, that the president puts in people who are going to follow his policies or her policies. We haven't done that yet, have we? Okay. So what the president gets back is probably the status quo, as opposed to what he would want that person to be doing. When it gets down, and as a senior Foreign Service officer, when I was back in Washington, I was right up against the political leadership. And at a certain level, they're not doing the president's bidding anymore. They're doing their bidding because it's far enough removed from the top that it doesn't get the visibility. So the career person is very capable generally, assuming that, and we are a merit promotion organization, that the career person would know what to do and would be advising the political person on what to do anyway. And the only difference would be if the president wants something specifically done and he talks to his own person, then he has more confidence in the fact that it will be done the way he wants it to be done. So it really, there is the first year of every administration is filled with carrying on the policies of the past. Because it takes that long to get people approved. For that takes that long to find out where the men's room or the ladies' room is. It just takes time. The backbenchers.
Yes, sir. Sunday's New York Times had an article on the authoritarian regime now in Hungary, particularly Budapest. And I'm wondering, did that have any influence from Russia?
Yes.
To push that forward or not?
Yes, I'm sure Russia is offering, just as we are in Budapest and other Hungarian cities, promoting our ideas. We will have the National Democratic Forum Institute and the National Republican Institute, taxpayer funded, goes out and does the same kind of proselytization for democratic market economic things, market-oriented economies. So I'm not against what we're doing. I just would like to be honest about the fact that we're all in the game. In Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland are the three most demonstrably authoritarian countries in Eastern Europe. Poland is in trouble with the EU for some of the things that it's doing, and the EU may censor it for that. But Hungary has a strong interest, as well as the Czech Republic, to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Do the registered communists in our country have much influence on our political system, be it Senate, House, bureaus?
Registered communists?
Yeah.
I don't know. There are. I guess there would still be, but who would they represent and who would they be talking for? I mean, China is only modestly communistic. It's just. Oh, okay, Cuba.
In our country, that they state they are.
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that there would be. But one of the things that came up during the Russiagate thing was that Senator Sessions had meetings with the Russian ambassador. That happens all the time. I mean, both of them are doing their jobs.
Didn't he lie about it? Like he said,
There's a question in the back. There's a question in the back corner.
I'm only arguing the accusation. Now, I can imagine Session has a list of people coming through his office, mostly people with checks in their hands to help with the re-election. So I'd be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't remember it. But I mean, I constantly sought to go and call on government officials to find out what they were thinking, what they thought about what we were thinking.
I have a lighthearted question for you.
Thank goodness.
A while back, Putin just took off and they couldn't find him. They didn't know where he was, what he was doing, whether he just went on vacation.
Oh, Putin.
Yeah, if he...
I have no idea what happened.
Well, that's
I thought that was lighthearted. I mean,
Early on, you talked about the country itself being in disarray and needing money. How much of Putin's domestic policies are they hampering the foreign policy? I imagine they'd be some kind of factor in our foreign relations.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. What is the relationship, or what percentage of time does Putin think about domestic issues as opposed to foreign issues? And I would think that he doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about domestic issues. He has a Prime Minister, Medvedev, who he would probably saddle with dealing with that. Again, the Russians have an incredible capacity to muddle through. And the leadership recognizes that. The czars recognized it. The Kremlin, or the commissars recognized it, and so does Putin. Up until something happens. There were the peasant revolts throughout the czar's period. It got to a certain point, and the peasants rose up. Pugachev revolts in the early 1800s, maybe late 1700s. Historian here? Good. That they would kill all the landowners, all the nobles that got in their way. And then the government would send the troops in, wipe them out, wipe out the leadership especially, and everything would go back and more or less to where it was before. Sometimes this led to reforms. There were reforms. The serfs were freed through one of those reforms. So there has been movement. But within that movement, there is, I think, still are those cardinal virtues or cardinal considerations of the group versus the individual, politics over economics, control over chaos, control over liberty. Sure.
Could you speak to the effect of Turkey now asserting itself and then its relationship to Russia on that end of their border?
It's a very interesting question. In fact, I did a television program that aired last Sunday, and that was one of the topics that we talked about, was Turkey talking to Russia about what I think are very tactical considerations of Turkey's interest in squashing the Kurds in Syria. The Kurds are really the stepchildren of the Middle East. They can't get a break. I mean, we're distancing ourselves right now, and I'm not disagreeing with the policy because I'm not sure what the alternative is. Are we willing to go to war with Turkey over the Kurds? So there are Kurds in Syria, there are Kurds in Iraq, and Kurds in Iran. And there was an opportunity after World War I to bring this all together, and the Balfour Doctrine. And no one was prepared to do that kind of heavy lifting. And sometimes that's what has to happen. We did a lot of nasty things after World War I, like putting Iraq together the way it was. No, that was the Brits earlier. The Brits earlier. Yeah, the Brits put those three parts of Iraq together because the British foreign policy mantra was divide and conquer. Have the groups fighting with each other so they're not fighting against you. So Turkey is moving into some very, very dangerous ground right now, and you're going to be talking about this next week, so I'm going to leave that for a wonderful person who's going to probably wow you.
Do the Russian oligarchs have a lot of sway over the Russian foreign policy, or does it kind of keep them under control?
Russian oligarchs, as opposed to the Slovaki, have to be very careful. Anytime, actually, their contributions to foreign affairs will be quietly given. Anytime they get any interest in domestic politics, they're going to jail. Khodorkovsky is a case in point. He got a little bit too big for his britches. Yes, ma'am.
I have a mic, but I have a loud voice.
Okay.
What is the current Russian, what is our current Russian policy?
Oh.
The morning or the afternoon?
I'm trying to look knowledgeable here. That's a hard question. Where's that lightly easy question that I had before?
Lighthearted.
Lighthearted, thank you. I think we have several drivers in our political establishment, in the Congress, specifically in the Senate, led by the distinguished senator from Arizona, John McCain, a wonderful war hero, a great man, but he hasn't seen a conflict he doesn't want to get involved in. They are pushing the administration into, I don't want to say dangerous waters, but they're pushing the administration to be tougher and tougher about Russia. My argument with this, again, goes back to cost and consequences. How long are we going to be willing, and if I'm right, that Ukraine is reverting back to where it was not that many years ago in 2004 when it went through that cycle before. You don't change a culture, you don't change the dynamics in a country by replacing a president and having demonstrations in the street. So I think Washington is being pushed towards being more aggressive towards Russia. And the thing that will probably change that is China. Because China and the South China Sea is another area, and you will get to talk about that. It's a very important topic. And what are we going to do about that? And we once had a national security strategy that we would have the military available to fight on two fronts. Well, how many fronts have we got? And the special forces that are being overused, are not loved by the rest of the military because they play by different rules and they don't have the same kinds of command structure and things like that. The generals don't like the special forces. So I think we have a serious problem. Let's go around the world. Where do we have a policy? In the Middle East. The only thing I can see is we getting caught here, caught there. So it is a troubling time in that respect. I hope there's an uplifting question that, yes, to follow that one. That was a good question. You can get to go to bed early tonight.
Are the Russian citizens who are abroad also citizens of those countries? like Latvia, the Russians in Latvia, are they also citizens of Latvia?
That's a very interesting question. The Lats, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians would not like to give them citizenship, but I think they're being forced by the EU to do so. Again, the EU, which would not want to do something favorable to the Russians, is indirectly helping the Russians. Yes.
I have a question. I have a pretty loud voice. When you were there, which is a fair amount of time ago,
Yes.
and the way it is now, I had a physician who was here, who was from Russia. So she had to must study as a young person. How their education, and are they willing to leave, and are they free? Is it difficult? Are they as citizens just, this is the way it is, and you feel downtrodden? What can we do? We stay here, or how can I get out of here? Do they have that feeling? Can I go to America, become a doctor?
We would be the obstacle there. Obviously, Russian education in basic education was outstanding. Outstanding. Its scientists were world class. Its painters, its writers. I mean, if you've gone through the golden and the silver age of Russian literature and count the major players that were involved in that, this is a very rich cultural country. And the theater, I had a chance when I was there the first time to go to the theater often. And it's almost like going to church. There is such reverence to that kind of cultural connection. Music. So I would say, now, doctors were not doctors are kind of like what school teachers were a long time ago. They couldn't get a job elsewhere, so they went into medicine. Now, that isn't they have some top doctors and they have some top hospitals. Obviously the Presidium would have had, the Central Committee would have had a special hospital, and they would have had top doctors there. But through the countryside, not much.
About your discomfort in the Russian airline, we can have that too. About food and discomfort.
What about the rubber chicken?
Yeah. A military question. Does NATO will continue with the display of the Star Wars system in Eastern Europe? I think that is going to include Poland and Ukraine.
No, not Ukraine.
No, Poland.
Poland and Romania.
Romania. The Poles more than eager, I'm sure. Yeah, so they will continue with the NATO will continue.
Yes, that would be a negotiation point at some point in time. I never bought the idea that we wanted to set up these kinds of radar interceptor sites in Eastern Europe because of Iran. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. Not when Russia's sitting right next door.
Because that is an offensive move from NATO to do that.
NATO has done a number of offensive moves, as I noted. And in the beginning, up until they put together that nest egg, they really weren't in a position to push back. But they're pushing back. And messing in our elections is part of it. And doing it in a way that I think they wanted us to know that they were doing it. They wanted us to be, we got to be worried about this. And I think we do need to be worried about it. That's another issue. But It was not to get Donald Trump elected president. Even though they may have preferred him to Hillary Clinton.
I have a question, the librarian. So the Olympics are going on. The Russian athletes have been sanctioned. How much does that get in the way of diplomacy, not only with the United States, but the other countries that supported that sanction?
When I was in Moscow in 1977 to 79, I was, among other things, the Olympic attaché. And so I went to all the sites. And when I transferred out just before the Olympics in the summer of 1979, I went back to the State Department to work on the boycott of the Olympic Games in Moscow committee at the State Department. Anyone who thinks that sports and politics don't mix, they actually don't mix well. But you don't have sports without politics on the international level. It just happens. We're boycotting those because of the invasion into Afghanistan. And then they turned around and boycotted us in Los Angeles. Anything else? Thank you all very much.
All right, thank you.